just going to start recording now. Please bear with me while I try to get this to share again. Okay, can you guys see the slide? Oh, okay. What about now? Let's just see what you're saying there. Nothing. Oh, bugger. Okay. Just a black screen. Maybe. Sorry, folks. There you see now. Okay, cool. Thank you for your feedback. I'll just read these messages. Can't see it, can't, still black, not anymore. Okay, so when I put it on the presentation, that's when it didn't like it. Sorry, folks, I don't know how I did it before. I'm going to have to practice. Share. So you can see my screen there, the learning objectives. Yes. So now if I try and I'm going to set up my show. What do you see when I do that? Black. Okay. Hang on, this might work. What about that? Yay. Okay, I think I've worked out the trick. Apologies for wasting time doing that. Okay, so now we're talking about behaviour and welfare. Once again, these are the learning objectives. I've tried to specify in the slides with an L or a B what relates to layers and broilers. So let's get right into poultry behaviour. So I guess to understand poultry, we need to see the world from a chicken's perspective. In terms of their sight, they have 300-degree vision and 26 degrees binocular vision. So which makes sense because they're a prey animal, so they can see almost all the way around to the back of their head, but they don't have very good vision up close. Birds can see colour and apparently they have a preference for red and blue, followed by orange and green. So often those sorts of colours will be used for feeders and drinkers in the sheds. Their smell is quite limited. They're not really that repelled by obnoxious odours, and their hearing is well developed, but they don't have that external pinna, obviously, and they're attracted to very low frequency, short duration sounds, essentially anything that sounds like a brooding or plucky hen. They have 300 taste buds, and they can discriminate between strong tasting compounds. So I guess just to further expand on that, if we talk about a chicken in the wild, they will often live on the jungle floor under heavy canopy and spend their day foraging and socializing with their flock. So in a group, there's normally a dominant male who establishes the territory with his ladies, and then you can have subordinate males living in the group as well, as long as they maintain that subordinate relationship with the dominant male. Hens, as I've said before, are seasonal breeders, and they're quite secretive about their nesting site, so it's often in a dark, quiet place. And as I've said before, that she lays on a 23 to 26 hour cycle and produces about 10 to 15 eggs before incubating them, with only having a break to feed and do some plumage care. So when she's sitting on her eggs, they say that she becomes broody. So she stops laying and she's just focusing on keeping those eggs at the correct temperature. Now, just going back a step, while the hen is laying the eggs, the male will meet with her regularly to mate with her, and he'll often escort her to and from the nest. So when the chicks hatch, they will immediately imprint on the hen and stay quite close to her, because obviously they rely on her to keep them nice and warm while they're in that brooding phase. And then at approximately 6 weeks of age, when they have finished that brooding phase, that's when the hen will encourage her chicks to roost. So sit up on a perch, and that's taking on a protective mechanism for them. At around 10 to 12 weeks, she'll start to wean them, so encourage them to find their own food. And at around 16 to 18 weeks is when the chicks will rejoin the flock, and they'll become part of the juvenile flock. Now, it's around that sort of 10 to 12 week mark when the chicks are weaned is also when the chicks start to establish their social hierarchy with their mates. So I guess that is an important part of being a chicken, knowing you're placed in the social hierarchy, because they do live in flocks. They are social animals. Now, birds, or chickens, sorry, I should say, can recognize one another from the shape of their comb and the wattles on their head, and they can obviously communicate with each other through clucking, but also the posture changes in their head are another form of communication. So with that in mind, I guess if we think about common poultry behaviours, if we think about that little story I just told on the jungle floor, the main natural behaviours for chickens are listed on the left-hand side. So we've got foraging, obviously an important component of their daily life, dust bathing and preening, perching and roosting for protection, social behaviour, nesting, courtship and being broody, being a seasonal breeder, and pecking. Now, I don't know why I put pecking down the bottom, because it's probably one of the most important chicken behaviours, because they peck to obtain food and water, they do it to establish personal space and their hierarchy, and they even peck to get out of the shell. So I guess with that in mind, if we then look to see what domestication has done, we can see some less desirable, I guess, behaviours associated with that. So feather pecking and cannibalism is a problem in the broiler and the layer industry, but probably more so the layer industry, probably because of the increased length of time. So a broiler lifespan is around 30 to 56 days, whereas a layer is obviously around for a year and a half, so a lot longer. And we'll talk about that at the end of this lecture. Broodiness, I guess, is a natural behaviour of hens, but it's one that we, excuse me, want to suppress because when they become broody, they can be a bit cranky and difficult to deal with, and also they stop laying. Perching, I've put a question mark there because it actually seems that perching is a learnt behaviour. So if you rear layer birds, for example, in a shed with just litter on the floor and no furnishings where they can perch, later in life they're unlikely to perch because they haven't learnt it or practiced it. So I guess, yes, it is a natural instinctive behaviour, but they have to learn it. And then heavy poultry, so obviously more of an issue in the broiler industry, but can also be an issue in layers as well. So these are just sort of things to keep in mind that we have changed with the domestication and intensification of both of these industries. And as I said, we're going to focus on feather pecking and heavy poultry at the end of this lecture. So now we're briefly going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the different housing systems. So we'll do broilers first, and then we'll move on to the layers. I guess something to keep in mind is this little quote that I've put at the bottom, in that it can be difficult to compare different housing systems due to the wide variation across systems. And sometimes it might be easier or better to compare specific design features within systems that have a better effect on bird welfare than the systems per se. And I guess that sort of leads into a question that I often get asked when talking about poultry in particular, is which production system do I think is the best? And I find that a hard question to answer when it really comes down to the management of the farm. So all these production systems can work really well, and the birds can have good welfare if you have good management. And hopefully, as we talk about them a bit more, that will become more apparent. But let's keep going. Okay, so this is what a broiler farm looks like. We saw a few pictures in the last lecture. They all look the same, these massive sheds. This is what it looks like inside the sheds with our feeder and drinker lines and the litter on the ground. So that's obviously conventional housing, and then there is the option for free range housing. Now, the thing to understand with free range broilers is that there's no legally binding definition of free range. So that means that when it says free range on a packet of chicken and it doesn't have any other accreditation system, it just means that they have access to an outdoor range and an indoor shelter. So it doesn't specify how big that range is or how long they have access to it in a day. So it's a bit of a sort of fluid definition, I guess. So when you're buying free-range chicken, you really need to look for the accreditation. So a common one is FREPA, which is Free Range Egg and Poultry Australia. So the macro brand at Woolworths or Lilydale are accredited with this system. And then RSPCA also has a free-range set of standards as well. So when they have these accreditation stickers, it means that they are producing those chickens in line with the standards stipulated by those bodies, I guess. So for example, with the RSPCA outdoors, they must have access to outdoors for 8 hours a day unless it's bad weather or against veterinary advice. And the total area they have access to must be 1 to 1.5 times the size of the total shed. And 30% of the length of the shed has to have openings so the birds can get out. Now, if you see an RSPCA sticker on some chicken, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's free range. It has to have, but if it has the RSPCA sticker and a free range statement, then that means that they are being raised in accordance with those standards. Now, an important thing to remember is that with free range, the birds will only go outside once they are fully feathered. So that happens at around 21 to 28 days of age, because you obviously don't want chickens without feathers going outside because they'll get cold and stress themselves. So, but saying that, if you think about how long a broiler chicken lives, it could be as early as 28 or 30 days that they get harvested. So it's a little bit, I don't know if people fully understand this sometimes, but sometimes those chickens only have 2 days of being outdoors before being harvested. So it's just something to keep in mind. In terms of Australian certified organic, so this type of accreditation system is focused on avoiding the use of synthetic chemicals such as pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and antibiotics. So in addition to having access to an outdoor area, in certified organic, they also have to be fed predominantly organic ingredients, and the birds are not allowed to be given antibiotics or routine vaccinations. There are exceptions to this, so when treatment is required by law or the disease cannot be controlled without organic management practices alone. So that's, I guess, further clarification on what organic is. Now, in terms of the advantages and disadvantages for broilers, I've done a bit of a summary table there. So in conventional housing, you have lower cost of production, and I guess that's because you've just got a little bit more control in terms of the environment that the birds are in. So as soon as they're allowed to go outside, then they can be exposed to different temperatures. Obviously, they're not going to be extreme temperatures because they won't be allowed outside if that's the case, but still fluctuation in temperatures. They'll have access to soil, which could potentially have disease if wild birds are defecating on it. So I guess the environment is a little bit less controlled, so therefore your disease is a bit more likely, so that could potentially increase the cost of production. And if the birds are subject to a little bit more stress, then obviously they're going to put more energy into that, which means that they might not grow as efficiently. So that's where that lower cost of production comes from. Obviously in the sheds there's no predators, and they're always close to food and water. In the free range system, you can't really put food and water outside because that's going to attract wild birds. So it's mainly just shaded areas and grass and soil out there. Obviously there's a lower stocking density for free range birds when they're allowed outside, but and there's more opportunity for foraging and dust bathing in different types of substrates. But yes, increased risk of predators and increased risk of disease. Now, in terms of legislation and accreditation around the broiler industry, so we have a document called the Model Code of Practice for the Welfare of Animals, Domestic Poultry, and that applies to broilers and layers, and it can be used as a reference document if you want to prosecute someone under the Animal Welfare Act. So the Model Code as a document itself is not legislation, but it does give recommendations and guidelines, and that's often what is referenced in prosecutions. Saying that though, the Model Code of Practice is actually being phased out for most of the livestock species in Australia, and it's moving towards a document called Australian Animal Welfare Standards and Guidelines. So for I think they have that for sheep and cattle at the moment, correct me if I'm wrong. But the document for poultry is in the final drafting phase, and it should be available in May 2021. And there's also the same document for land transport of livestock, so obviously birds are covered in that as well. Now, I mentioned the accreditation systems, so those are voluntary accreditations that producers can be part of to say that they raise their birds to a certain standard. And if you want to look at those standards, then the RSPCA and FREPA are readily available online, and you can see that there's been a very large uptake by industry for that. A point to make is that, especially with RSPCA, if you want to sell your chicken with the RSPCA sticker, you obviously have to meet the standards that they require, and you have auditors come in and check up on you that you're doing that. But also it costs extra money to have the RSPCA sticker on your packaging. So often what will happen in a shed, for example, is that yes, all the birds will be raised under the RSPCA standards, but only half of them will be sold with the sticker and the other half will be sold as regular chicken, just because of the cost involved of putting the sticker on the packaging. So just a little bit of interesting insight there. Okay, so that's the broiler industry. So we're going to move on to the layer industry now. So we'll start with cage housing. When we talk about cage housing, there's a few different definitions. So we have conventional cages, which are sort of like your battery cages, I guess. So they're housed indoors in sheds, usually in groups of maybe 6 to 9, and there's usually about 8 levels of cages with mesh wire floors. Saying that though, the poo from the cage on the top doesn't go to the cage underneath. You have a manure belt under the cage, so the manure goes through the wire flooring, gets caught on the manure belt, and then it gets moved off. You can have colony cages, which I haven't seen much of, to be honest, but they do exist. So that's where you're housing a larger number of birds in the group. And then you have furnished cages. So those are cages that contain furnishings such as nest boxes, perches, and scratch pads. So this is what a typical cage farm looks like. So just to give a little bit of history around this. So I mentioned in the last lecture that in the 1950s, 60s, when flocks started to get bigger and the production of eggs started to intensify a bit more, they found that they were starting to have issues with disease, parasite burdens, and predation in their larger flocks. So they needed a way to manage this. So the government's egg board at the time actually recommended that they get the birds off the ground into cages to try and address these issues. So when they did that, certainly mortality rates dropped and the use of medication for disease dropped as well. And that kind of ticked along for a couple of decades. And then it was really in the 1990s that people sort of started to become more aware of how birds were being produced, and the fact that they were in cages didn't really sit comfortably with the public. So that's when you started to see the emergence of other production systems such as cage-free or barn or free range. Now, in 2000, it was decided that the hens, there was a lot of pressure on industry and government that hens needed more space. So it was legislated that the stocking density had to be increased, and the industry had 8 years to upgrade to bigger cages. So obviously doing that meant a huge investment from the industry, because when you look at all those cages, that obviously costs a lot of money to make them. So to upgrade your entire farm, people would have invested millions to do that, and there's no help from the government as well. So it's only really in the last 10 years that they've been trying to recoup the costs of that latest change to the industry. Now, when it was announced that the model code of practice was being phased out and the new welfare standards and guidelines would be available, or would be the new document, I guess the body looking after this put a call out to the public to make comment on how chickens were raised. And there was quite a large response from the public, and there was a big sort of push, I guess, for moving away from cages. So certainly the industry sees that trend. The issue is that they've already invested such a large amount of money in the last 10 years. It would be difficult to then change again to something like a furnished cage, which would obviously be another huge investment from the industry without any help from the government. So that's, I guess, the conundrum that the industry is facing at the moment. Also saying that, yes, the consumer preference for cage eggs has dropped, but there are still people that buy cage eggs, which is totally fine. I'm not saying if that's right or wrong, but obviously if there's still a consumer need or want for it, then that's how they're going to continue producing the eggs. So just a little bit of insight into the industry there. Hopefully that was helpful. But as I've said before, there's definitely a trend to move away from cage eggs. So in 2005, it was 75% of the volume share of the market, and these days it's less than 50%. When you look around the world, cages have been phased out in 28 countries in the EU. New Zealand's got a phase-out plan, and Canada also has a phase-out plan, and several states in the US has also passed legislation to phase it out. And then a couple of years ago, Coles also said that they were no longer going to stock cage eggs. So they didn't consult with industry when they did that, which is a bit of an interesting move, but I guess that's the direction things are going in. So I guess to highlight in the EU where they have phased out the cages, the government does play more of a role in helping farmers with those types of transitions. I'm not sure about New Zealand and Canada, but just interesting to note. Okay, So we're just going to have a look at the science, what the science says about cage eggs, because obviously when you look at a picture like this, it can be quite confronting, and it's quite easy to anthropomorphize. So say, well, I wouldn't want to be in that environment, so therefore the chickens don't want to be. I guess we have to remember that humans and chickens are very different animals, in that chickens are prey species, and their main motivation in life is to find shelter and protection, and food and water, obviously. So when we are trying to assess if hens are happy in cages, we often have to turn to the science and the literature to help us with this. In terms of how we assess if we know, if we assess if chickens are happy, when scientific experiments are done, these are the main ways of assessing hen happiness, because obviously they can't verbalize or express their feelings. So motivation tests are based on the assumption that a chicken's preference will be influenced by its emotion, and the overall goal for a chicken would be to avoid harm and facilitate growth and reproduction and survival. So that's why motivation tests are often used in these types of experiments. We can obviously measure behaviours, although we have to use some caution with stereotypies, because they are not always associated with stress. Cognitive bias is making the assumption that a certain emotion will influence an animal's decision-making process when presented with ambiguous cues. So this one's a bit complicated, but what happens is that you train an animal with positive and negative cues initially, and then you give them an intermediate cue and you see how they will respond. So if a hen, for example, is in a negative emotional state, if it's given an ambiguous cue, then you would expect it to react in the same way it reacted to the negative cue. Or if it was in a positive emotional state and it was given an intermediate cue, you would expect it to react in the way it did when it received the positive cue. It's a little bit confusing, but I hope I've explained that well enough. I mean, this is just out of more interest rather than specifically having to know it. And then there's also physiology. So we can obviously measure stress hormones, their growth and egg production. We can look at the shells and see if there's extra calcium deposits or blood stains, which can also indicate stress on the birds. So we do have to use a little bit of caution, though, when we are interpreting cortisol or glucocorticoids, because events that are not necessarily positive or negative can trigger this hormone. So, for example, mating in rats or exercise in humans can increase cortisol or glucocorticoid levels, and they're not necessarily negative things. So we just have to be a little bit cautious with that interpretation. And then, of course, looking at the health of the bird. So what's the disease burden? What's the mortality like? So this table comes from a review by Paul Hemsworth, and I've referenced the review down the bottom there. It's around a 16 to 18 page read, but it really, it summarizes all the research that's been done about cage hen welfare in the last 10 or so years. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, it's a good source of information. Okay, but I've tried to summarize the findings as best I could. So we've got the comparison of conventional, furnished and non-cage production systems. So that could be a barn or it could be free range. When we look at their stress hormone levels, the science says that cage hens and hens in furnished cages have less or the same levels of stress hormones than hens in non-cage systems. In terms of the behavioural repertoire, it obviously goes without saying that the cage system prevents hens from displaying behaviours such as nesting, pecking, scratching, dust bathing, perching, etc. When you look at the furnished cages, certainly there is opportunity for them to display those behaviours, but whether or not it's that desire is fully satisfied still requires further investigation. And obviously in a non-cage system, you have the highest freedom to express any behaviours. Although an interesting point was made in this review, in that we tend to be very focused on the hens being able to express natural behaviours. But another way of thinking about it is that in a cage system, once the birds have been fed and watered and they've got their shelter, the question is, how do they fill in the time? So obviously, if they could perform natural behaviours, then they'd do that to fill in the time. But is there a way to provide another form of enrichment that would do the same thing, but is not necessarily a natural behaviour? Would that achieve the same sort of happiness or affective state? So I thought that was an interesting point raised in that paper. Infectious disease is obviously reduced in conventional and furnished systems compared to non-cage. So even in a barn system, I guess because you're more likely to run into a higher number of different birds, then the spread of disease is more likely than if you're in a small group. And then obviously in a free-range system, you're exposed to the outside, so more likely to come into contact with rodent droppings or droppings from wild birds, etc. Feather pecking and cannibalism is less in conventional and furnished cages compared with non-cage systems. This is most likely because it's a surprising result. It's most likely because the birds are under less environmental stress in a conventional or furnished cage system. So we're able to control their environment perfectly in terms of temperature and humidity, etc., and run-ins with other hens, whereas in a non-cage system, we've got less control over that, so then you're more likely to trigger a chicken to start that sort of behaviour. And then also that chicken, because it can interact with all the other chickens, is likely to damage more chickens than just the ones in its social group, if that makes sense. Mortality is reduced in conventional and furnished cages. Fractures at depopulation, so because the hens in cage systems cannot exercise or move around as much, that means that their bones are not as strong. And when you go to depopulate the shed, when they reach the 72, 78-week mark, you are more likely to see fractures because their bones are weaker. Now, it's not in high numbers, but it's obviously still a welfare issue. And then heterophil and lymphocyte ratio is a measure of white blood cells. So that's immunity, but it can also be a measure of chronic stress. So interesting that in a conventional housing system, it was raised compared with furnished or a non-cage system. Okay. So these are the pros and cons of the different production systems, and I mean, we sort of discussed these as we've gone along, but I will let you read them at your leisure. I guess one thing that we haven't really spoken about yet is cleaner eggs. So obviously in a cage system, whether that be conventional or furnished, The hens lay their eggs, it goes onto a conveyor belt and then gets moved along very quickly. In a non-cage system where the hens are in a barn or can go outside, there's the risk that they lay their eggs on the floor, and obviously then you can get droppings and other dirt on them. So that increases the risks of dirty eggs. I think everything else has been covered. Oh, and then obviously a reduced carbon footprint as well. So these are kind of what the furnished cages look like. To be honest, I haven't been on a farm and seen them in real life, but they are, well, obviously this is what the alternative that they're using in Europe at the moment is. So that's where I've got most of the information from. So they've got a perch in there. The birds can use the nest boxes, and I guess it's an important point to make that a hen is very, very motivated to use a nest box. So when you look at the studies in that review that I mentioned before, a hen will try and move a weighted door to get through to get to a nest box. So that's how high the motivation is to lay her egg in a nice, quiet place. The birds are moderately motivated to use the dust baths. They seem to maintain good production and low levels of stress. They get more movement, so therefore you get less fractures at depopulation. There is some restriction with wing flapping and preening, but you achieve the best mortality rates. So in theory, this seems like a promising option in terms of an alternative to a conventional cage, but the big conundrum is who's going to pay for it, and that's the problem facing the industry. And this is kind of what it looks like. It's obviously a bit tricky to get a good photo. I guess the only thing to keep in mind is that if you've got this type of setup, the birds can potentially poo in it, and it's obviously not getting cleaned away. So therefore, could that be a source of disease? But yeah, that's something to consider, I guess. But in terms of the space, it is higher. So a conventional cage at the moment, the birds get 550 centimeters squared per hen, but obviously in an enriched, it's a bit higher. And yeah, I think that's all I need to say about that. Okay, so moving on. This is a barn system. I'm just conscious of the time. Hopefully we can finish on time. This is a barn system. So this is about 10% of the market, which I don't really understand why it's not very popular. Maybe you guys can write in some comments. We can discuss it further at the workshop tomorrow. But the hens are free to move about in the shed. They have nest boxes up the top there, which are slightly tilted and have a conveyor belt, so then the eggs can get moved along. Obviously, increased risk of floor eggs, but obviously hens are motivated to use nest boxes, so they will use them most of the time. You can control their temperature. They're free of predators. And then this is another variation. Sorry, so this one obviously has grated flooring, and this one has litter, so you can get different variations of a barn system. So these are what's sold as cage-free in the supermarket, and the hens are indoors all the time. The size of the shed obviously will dictate how many hens are in there, so you can have hundreds or thousands of hens depending on the size of the operation. And the floors can vary, as I said before, and yeah, always close to feed and water. So these are the pros and cons of the barn system, and I'll let you read them at your leisure. Okay, and then finally we have free range. So where the hens have access to an outdoor range during the day for at least 8 hours, and then they're housed in the sheds at night. Obviously, in extreme weather, they won't be allowed to go outside. You need to try and protect from predators, but it's obviously an ongoing challenge. You need to protect them from the elements, and you need to be very mindful of biosecurity, so particularly salmonella and avian influenza. So a little bit different to the broiler industry in that the egg industry said if you're going to put a free range label on your egg carton, then you have to abide by certain rules. So even if the eggs are not associated with a accreditation system, if it says free range on a carton of eggs, the hens have to have access, here we go, they have to have meaningful and regular access to an outdoor area during daylight hours while they're laying eggs. So obviously not when they are growing, so not when they're young chicks. And then they have to be able to roam and forage outdoors, and you have to state what your stocking density is. And that is legislated. So you'll know, hopefully next time you go buy some eggs, you can look for the stocking densities on the packet. Okay, there's some pictures of what free range hens can look like. And then these are the pros and cons, and I'll let you read them at your leisure. In terms of welfare assessment of poultry on farm, it's the same documentations as for the broiler industry. I've just presented it slightly differently. So in terms of compulsory legislation, we've got the Animal Welfare Act, and we have the Animal Welfare Standards and Guidelines currently in draft. They'll be available in May this year. The standards will be legislation, guidelines obviously guidelines, and then we've also got the same document for land transport of livestock, which chickens are covered in there. We have the Australian and New Zealand food standard codes. So that's obviously around eggs. So in those codes, they say that you don't have to wash eggs, but you can't sell a dirty egg. So most places will wash their eggs, and we'll talk about that next lecture, but you obviously can't sell an egg with fecal material dirt on it. And then we've obviously legislated the national standards for free range labelling in the layer industry. Some guidelines documents are the Model Code of Practice, soon to be replaced by this other document, and then the voluntary programs. The common ones are Eggs Australia, Quality Assurance Program, and that can be any production system, and then also obviously FREPA, RSPCA, and Coles and the like. So these are extra programs that a producer can choose to be part of, to say, yes, I raise my eggs according to these standards. They have an auditor come to the farm frequently to make sure that those standards are being met, and then you can sell those eggs with the labelling. So it's just another way of giving the consumers assurance that your product is being raised to the best standards. Okay, so as I alluded to before when we started talking about the different production systems, yes, I guess it is important to understand the disadvantages and advantages of each of the production systems, but it's more about the management on that farm. So this becomes quite important when we're talking about health or a production issue on farm. So when you've got disease, obviously the pathogen as an important factor, and the bird is an important factor, but we can't forget about the environment. So are those birds under stress with their temperature control or with the social environment, or have we got their feed right? Are we doing everything in terms of biosecurity to keep pathogens out of the farm? So this is just a nice concept in terms of thinking about investigating a production issue on farm. Now, these are the different factors that are going to affect chicken growth and quality. So obviously it's in every producer's interest to look after the birds in terms of giving them the best nutrition, the best environment, the best ventilation, the best stocking density, so they can perform at their best. In terms of looking at a problem in a poultry production system, these are the main parameters that we look at for chickens. So mortality, egg production percentage, that obviously only applies for layers and breeders. Hatchability is only relevant for breeders, and the growth rate and the feed conversion ratio is an important factor to look at. But we can't forget, even though we're mostly focusing on the flock, we can't forget the individual. And these are the types of signs that you would notice in a sick individual. The problem with birds is that they are a prey animal, and so they have this preservation reflex. And I found this working in small animal practice. Whenever someone would bring in their sick bird, they'd only bring in the bird when it was obviously showing signs of being unwell, and often by that stage it's too late. So it's in the bird's interest to look healthy until obviously it gets to a point when it can't. So obviously this is a very happy looking bird in terms of it's standing up, it's got, well, I guess it's just looking healthy and ready to investigate its environment. This bird is not looking so well. It's puffed itself up, it's slightly crouched, it's moved itself away from the other birds, or the other birds have moved itself away from them, or themselves away from it. And then obviously this is a very sick looking bird. So I'll just finish on these last two slides, and then we can finish this lecture in the next lecture time slot. Just in terms of the reality of being on a broiler or layer farm, obviously the birds, in terms of their monetary value, is not very high. So if you do have a sick bird, or a bird that's injured itself, it's unlikely that the farmer will isolate that bird and treat it individually, put it in a hospital pen, etc., because one, it's difficult to have the facilities to do that, and two, that bird could pose a risk to the other birds, especially if a pathogen isn't involved. So it's most likely, if you do have a sick bird, that individual will get euthanized. But if you do have a flock problem, then a treatment will most likely be given to the flock in terms of antibiotics or whatever else, and that can be given in the food or water. So just out of interest, you don't have to learn this or anything, but this is the method used to euthanize birds on farm. So it's called cervical dislocation. Okay, not a very nice note to end on, but I'm going to pause it there. Oopsies, I'm going to stop sharing. I'll just put my camera on to say goodbye. Thanks everyone for your attention, and I'll see you guys in the workshop tomorrow, and we'll finish this lecture in the next time slot. But I'll stay online for the next couple of minutes if you guys have any questions. Okay, thanks. Hi, Caitlin. So just answering your question there. So for the other subcategories of pasture eggs, is there any legislation around what can be put on a label? It's just the free range. Sorry, I'll just answer that. So it's just the free range requirements. So they obviously have to put their stocking density. In terms of the pasture raised egg category, it's a bit of a contentious issue with the main egg body. So the main egg body, Eggs Australia, does recognise cage, barn and free range production systems, but they don't really recognise pasture systems. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the pasture egg industry is a little bit less regulated from that point of view. But obviously, if they're putting free range on their carton, then legally they have to put the stocking density and obviously go by the rules of the birds having meaningful access to an outdoor range. And would you say feed conversion would be the main driver that keeps the cost of chicken meat down? Yep, you're spot on there, Caitlin. Feed conversion is what makes chicken so cheap.